Hello, I'm Angela Princewell,
And I'm Shereen Appy.
and our topic today is reconciliation, issues and concerns. So let me set this up for you. When people separate, and obviously, contrary to what people think, the law actually requires lawyers to explore whether there's a possibility of reconciliation, right? And no, please do not interpret that to mean that we can make your ex get back to you. It just means we would, ask if counseling is appropriate. For example, we would encourage you to go do that, and so in that process, issues can arise, right? And it usually happens in a scenario where one person wants the reconciliation and the other person doesn't. So let's see, how best do we approach this? Let's look at this. Maybe should we look at it from individual issues that arise as a result of a separation and kind of go through that? Okay. So let's talk about the big one, the matrimonial home or the family home to include people who aren't married. Um, how does that kind of factor in? How does reconciliation make dealing with the matrimonial home more difficult?
So, are you talking about in the context of actual reconciliation or where one party hasn't accepted?
I think I want us to focus on this podcast on where one person,
It's not accepting.
yes,
And that's actually a common theme. Sometimes, you'll see that, well, I'm not willing to walk away or I don't want to separate. And a lot of issues arise from that. But in pertaining to the matrimonial home, a lot of it becomes to the ties of, okay, them not wanting to actually divide the home or deal with the matrimonial home. So if they, we're talking about entertaining a buyout or a sale, like they don't want to entertain it because they think, well, if I get rid of the home, and what if we get back together? And a lot of the time it's in their forefront of the mind, like, okay, well, I don't want to then sell the house and then lose the equity and then have to, basically go buy a new home and deal with all that, because a lot of people don't come to terms with the separation, and one party's holding on to the relationship along with property, so mainly the matrimonial home. So it becomes very hard to get those issues dealt with because of one party's inability to accept that the relationship is over from one party's perspective, and you need both parties to be on the same page.
yeah. And what we always say is if it's a jointly owned home, you don't have too much of a choice. And we get it, we understand. Because if you do make up and one party has allowed you, caused you to sell the home, and if there's children involved now, you've had to move schools for them. And so we know it gets complicated, but the point is you are where you are. And if one party wants to move ahead with it, they can. And I know there's also this misconception of they have to wait a year, in terms of married people. No, the 1 year wait time is only for divorce. Um, they can move right away for a sale of the home. And I think that's something I really want to get across, that when it's a jointly owned home, the way the Ontario law is phrased, it doesn't leave a lot of room for discretion for a judge. So if it's a jointly owned home and one party wants it sold, they will get that order. Now, there are exceptions where the person's being oppressive and being vexatious and things like that. But for most people, the home is the largest asset that they have. If you're separated, it just defies fairness to think that one party would remain in the home while the other party has to go rent or squat with family members and things like that. Like from a fairness perspective, the courts would say, well, if they want their equity in the home so that they could go buy another place, the courts would entertain that. Now, if you're an above average income family, and I mean very much above average, and you have the resources to allow one person remain in the home, let's say is mortgage free, and you have multiple other properties where the other person can go to, then there's a possibility of holding on to that property for much longer until things eventually go to a trial and whatnot. But even then, still be careful because there's cost consequences, right? It's just the law that they have a right to realize their equity, and it's just sooner or later they will get that order whether or not you want the reconciliation.
Absolutely. And if you're looking at the context of, like, if you, let's say, it's you that wants to hold on to the relationship, and, you're willing to maybe give yourself some space and you move out of the home to allow the other party. There's some concerns about, the payments, and it depends, of course, if like to join the own home and things like that. So there's other considerations that would play a role in terms of reconciliation if somebody leaves the home to allow basically, I've seen situations where people, have considered that maybe they'll just separate physically from the home, and a lot of the time it's okay, well, what does that mean in terms of the legalities of it? Sometimes if it's a longer period of time, they could be entitled to occupational rent if it's a jointly owned home. So that might play a role as well.
Yeah, and there's the practical side of it too, right? Because I find that one party, for the vast majority of people, and again, some of these would not apply, as I said, if you're a higher net worth individual, if you have, a lot more disposable income to work with. But for the vast majority of middle income people, one party most times cannot carry the home. They're looking for the other side to contribute and things like that. So there's that competing obligation. There's their obligation, they need to take care of themselves. There's the obligation to make sure that they protect this asset. And then, and I find that even in some cases where one person agrees to pay for the home by themselves, they're struggling. And so, if it's our client and they're struggling like that, and it's heartbreaking for us to watch, right? And we get it. And I always say you just want to minimize conflict in your life as much as possible, period. If you're going to reconcile, not being in that dream home that you have should be the list of your worries. Like if you guys are back together, you would create another dream home. It would, and maybe that's where spirituality comes into it. Maybe your new downsized home could be the perfect home for you to have a happily ever after. Or in fact, if we want to push spirituality like really far, we could be like, this house had bad karma and or whatever, bad juju, whatever, and now you can move to a new home. But I mean, I'm playing there a little bit, but I'm trying to emphasize the point that I know that reconciliation is one reason why people hold on to the family home and they don't want to let it go. And I just want if people to understand that there are consequences to that. As Shireen said, you could be exposed to occupation rent, you could be exposed to costs if the other side has to go to court to fight you to eventually get the home sold. And don't think that they're not going to get that order. They most likely will. So if you can negotiate something. And then lastly, the practical considerations. Is it really worth all the trouble that you're going through just to keep this home? But even tied into the home, I'm not sure, did you want to add anything about the home? Okay. Tied into that is also support, right? Because a lot of times when one person is hoping to, reconcile, and then there's the home that they're not letting go, chances are you're not getting support payments, because if the person's contributing to the home, then they're probably not paying child and spousal support, right?
Yeah, or if they're not accepting that, like, this is a situation where they sorry, actually have to deal with the support obligations. They believe, well, hey, we're going to get back together. I don't want to actually finalize this, do the financial disclosure, and actually sit there and deal with these issues. And that's the impediment to a lot of issues where one party hasn't accepted that the relationship is over and the other party wishes to move on. And don't get me wrong, like we've seen situations where people do ultimately get back together. But to say that, reconciliation and someone's unwillingness to accept the relationship being over is a big impediment to actually finalizing issues and dealing with support. And obviously the home that we've already discussed.
And what's sad with this too is when eventually, things blow up and the lawyers get involved, and it takes several years, and eventually one party, whether they're forced by court or they just get up one day and know that it actually is over, then we have to deal with post-separation adjustments of several years, right? So in this scenario where we're speaking of, there is going to be the home. Did the other side contribute or not? So imagine if this is a situation that drags on for 3 years. Now we have to look at your mortgage, property taxes, home insurance, who paid what. Chances are, because you're not also separating things physically, maybe your home insurance and your car insurance is tied together. And then we get into scenarios where someone's arguing, well, I paid the insurance for his car or her car, and now they need to reimburse me. And you can imagine lawyers are, we're not that expensive, but we're also not cheap. So imagine where we're sitting there having to sort out your insurance to figure out what portion of your insurance is your home versus your car and whose insurance. Like
Yes, and a commingling of funds with your joint assets, if both of your pays are going into an account, an adjustment from the date of separation onwards, and it becomes very time consuming and expensive.
Mhm.
So you have to be careful that, holding on to the reconciliation period could also lend yourself to bigger support obligations, bigger financial consequences.
Oh, I like that you said that because while one party is holding on, well, if you're the person that is refusing to deal with these issues at this time and your income goes up, then if you're the payer, then now you've created bigger financial obligations for yourself, at least in terms of spousal support, for example, that you could easily maybe have lumped out at one point or could have set an amount and just have that only subject to, a material change. But now because you've not dealt with it and now your income's increased and then there's the expectation that, well, my income at the date of separation was, x number of dollars, but it doesn't really work that way. It's the time the court is looking at it is generally the amount they would use in calculating support. So you want to be mindful of that. And then even the retroactive component of it as well,
Yeah,
right?
so imagine you owing, not wanting to deal with these issues, owing a balloon payment, and then maybe your child's going to post-secondary school and you're also having to contribute to that cost. And these are costs that people are not looking, future forward for because they're not, and normally you would want to deal with them as they come. But if you're having to deal with retroactive pieces and, maybe life changes are happening, maybe, you're owing a significant sum of money and maybe you even have a reduction in your income
Mhm.
and your ability to pay those amounts. So a lot of financial consequences can take place if you're not careful.
Yes, yep, exactly. And then there's the parenting part of it too.
Yes, parenting, like we said, like with all issues, if someone doesn't want to deal with the issues, they're not going to want to set parenting schedules, some parenting parameters. It makes parenting difficult to deal with. It also makes parenting in general for the children very difficult because of the dynamic.
Yeah.
You have parents that sometimes would involve the children, especially if, they'll say, for example, mom is breaking up the family, and it's heartbreaking to see, and it happens often, unfortunately, but, unnecessarily involving the children, whether you mean to or not, someone's inability to accept that the relationship breakdown is there also hinders, a very troubling time for the children to get adjusted because they're in a state of constant confusion, especially because one parent is very adamant that the relationship is over and the other parent is still holding on to that. And there's some clear issues with respect to, what a parenting schedule would look like, what the involvement of the children should be, and the behavior of the children. And ultimately, that's something you want to figure out because the children should be shielded from conflict on all costs. If you're having issues with respect to reconciliation, I would always say try to define at least some sort of carve out some parenting time. If you're living in the same home, have some very strict dynamics. If you want to do activities together, and that also becomes troubling too, because sometimes, well, a parent who is wanting to separate would, still want to do things as a family just to keep things normal for the children. And that sometimes gets misconstrued. A
Yeah.
lot of the time we have, people saying, well, we reconciled because they went on a family trip. And it was just, or we celebrated Christmas, or we normally go to our in-laws for, the holidays. And now, we're together, but it becomes more difficult to co-parent with someone if that relationship is not dealt with.
No, that's a very good point. And I've also found in these situations as well that the parent that doesn't want or the parent that's holding on to the relationship who can even start exhibiting gatekeeping, alienating behaviors, right? Because at least that's one thing in some cases that they can control, or even financially, if it's the payor that wants to hold on to the relationship, then they're refusing to pay support or contribute to the other, financially when they need to as a way of control, because that's the only, and I don't mean control here in the general, domestic violence sense, just control of the situation. It's the only thing they can hold on to.
And talking about alienation actually is very important because a lot of people don't really see it. Well, at least no one really knows in 2020 is hindsight, but realistically, if you look at, if a parent is alienating a parent, whether they're intentionally or unintentionally doing so, there are some consequences to that. So, in the big picture of things, if you're alienating the child, whether or not it's intentional or not, that actually might be a detriment to you and your future parenting rights. So you want to be careful when you're, involving the children and, being inappropriate with your conversations, even though it might seem appropriate, it's not. Most of
Yeah.
the time it's not. A lot of the time people will share schedules because they think the children should have a say, and yes, it's relative to their ages, but there's a time and a place and an appropriate way to do it, and it needs to be on consent and friendly, and I often say, like, use a family counselor. But most people who don't want to accept that the relationship is over don't want to participate in counseling or push really hard to do counseling because they think that that would ultimately lead to a reconciliation, and then the other parent being, hesitant because they know the ulterior motives of that person. So it's just important to note, like, what can happen and things that you shouldn't do while you're in that period of adjustment.
I think a big concern for me too during this period is the emotional state of the parent that's, holding on to the hopes of reconciliation. And I'm being mindful here because, again, Shireen, you've said this earlier, and I think it bears repeating. We're not saying reconciliation is impossible. We're just saying you are where you are, deal with things where you are, and whatever comes later, you could still be open to reconciliation. And we've had this happen many times. I've had a matter that settled just before trial, and I think it was at the November trial sittings. This must have been about 2016 or thereabout. And in April, we actually got an invite, April of 2017. So literally a few months later, we get an invite to this client's wedding vows being renewed from the same man that we had gotten her divorced from, right? So just, I mean, November till April, that's how many months? That's like 6 months, so if even, right? So
And
about
that's why
5 months.
generally the courts would at least wait a year for you to
Yeah.
get a
So
divorce.
they had waited. So in this case, it had taken about 3 years. I mean, if we're getting, by the time we were getting to the trial stage, we had clearly gone through the court process. We had started with negotiating, and it had been a long and painful process. And it was back in the day when everything was in file boxes, and we had, we logged them to court. And it was just interesting to see that it took so many years to get to this point where you're divorced, we've separated your finances and everything, and we were being invited to renewal of the vows. We've also had a very much older couple, and this was one of our associates. It wasn't my file directly, and it was the same thing. They were much older. They separated, and then eventually decided to come back just before they signed the agreement. They made up. So it can happen, is what we're. So we're no stranger to people, and we love it. Like, I mean, I know we do a lot
You
of
know
work.
what? Praise God. Reconciled at the courthouse.
Oh, that's
Had their first
sweet.
court date and they got back together.
I
I mean, and
know.
it's
I love
interesting.
rom-coms, so it warms my heart when I see those happen in real life. So it's exciting. I mean, I do wonder what they say about us in their homes at that time, because I'm sure, we're not best friends there, but we know our clients love us, so they're standing up for us in their homes. But so we expect we know that these things happen, and you know your partner, you know your situation. If you know that you will reconcile with this person, we're not trying to change your mind about that. We're just saying deal with the legal issues. If the home needs to be sold, sell it. If you can buy out his or her interest, do that. If there's support issues that need to be taken care of, do it. Enter into a separation agreement. Enter into, make sure you make your parenting plans and stick with your schedule. And then, and then move on. If you
Even if
do,
it's an interim agreement dealing with
yes.
some issues, right? Like sometimes people are like, well, I'm really sure that like we could work on this. And sometimes maybe the other party's a little receptive. So you're like, I don't want to necessarily deal with all these issues, but it's imperative that you have at least some kind of framework for the initial, for that odd time, for that period of time.
Yeah.
It's always recommended you deal with those issues, but even if not on a final basis, at least on a partial or an interim basis, so that you can actually get some momentum. But yeah, all of these things that you shouldn't necessarily ignore.
Mhm.
And a lot of people don't necessarily ignore, but it's more from an emotional state of mind.
That's where you read, that's exactly what I wanted to talk about, because the emotional,
It's difficult.
it
It's
is.
always, I after, seeing kind of like these scenarios, it actually makes the most sense to maybe seek some sort of additional support, some therapy before even seeing maybe a lawyer, just to kind of get to terms with where you're at. And a lot of the time, people, will go through a therapeutic process while also going through, this family court matter. And it makes sense. It does. It makes you, healthier. It helps communicate if, especially if you have children, it's effective for co-parenting and kind of working towards parameters. If there's issues of, domestic violence, of course, there's some special considerations that need to take place. But I always would suggest doing kind of, I wouldn't say therapy, because everyone has a different form of therapy in that sense, because it's emotionally tolling, especially if you've not accepted it. It's not that you're ignoring it, but even when it comes to something as, if you were in a better state of mind, if the other party was asking to sell the house or to buy out the house, you would have probably maybe you would have entertained it more if you were in a better mental state. But a lot of the time, we don't want you to make emotional decisions, and we understand that it's hard to kind of just put a business, mindset to something so personal and sentimental like your home and your children. That's fair. But sometimes making a less reactive and emotional decision is probably the best. So it's something that just might be worthwhile doing.
I agree with you 100%. You have to, you have to deal with the emotions that come with these things, right? There's the hurt, there's then, and y- you see clients go through, from there's the love and wanting the person back, and then there is, the how it's better than it's better for the children, and then it becomes the hurt, and how could they do that to the family? And everything you're saying is absolutely, it's valid, right? And we don't doubt that. But if the other person does want to deal with the legal issues, we would rather you get help, so and be able and then be able to instruct your lawyers with the legal issues, rather than having a court force a settlement down your throat, right? If you've built your dream home with this person, for example, and you guys had plans, or even in terms of support, like the number of, I know how much it hurts when maybe one person has spent most of their lives maybe not investing in their own futures because they thought they were going to get the pension. That I had spoken to someone at one point that they had these dreams of moving to Italy, and they had bought a home in Italy, and they were going to retire in a few years and move there. Even if I gave that home in Italy to this client and I gave her the finances, I'm not going to give the dream is broken, and I get that. But the reality is, for most people, you're not going to retire in Italy anymore, and you're going to have limited, access to the retirement funds that were saved up. So that's a very hard pill to swallow. It's not just the dollar amount, it's not just the physical location. It's, you've spent all these years building this dream, and it's a lot to let go,
Absolutely. It's a
right?
construction. It's a new chapter, and a lot of people want to hold on to, kind of what was promised, what was envisioned.
Yeah.
Sometimes the new vision, to be honest though, when I see people, a year or 2 years later after separation, the amount of satisfaction it gives me that they are
Yeah.
truly in a happy place
Yes.
is so great. And then when I hear that they're co-parenting very well, it does take time. Not everyone is going to work out in that great picture. But obviously if you work on yourself and you deal with these issues as best as you can, and you know what, even if you're not the party who's accepting that the relationship is over, we're not necessarily think that you're dealing with, the most perfect person on the other side. So we understand that those tensions can be, difficult to deal with, and maybe they would make it more difficult to deal with. So we hear you. It is a process, and there's no judgment from our perspective. We just kind of want to help navigate where you are in your current state to better assist you.
Yeah. And if you're, if you need to take some time, and if you're seeking professional help to deal with these issues, then that might be something we can, put forward to the other lawyer and say, we just need some time and you're not in a place to deal with it now. That's a different conversation from you don't want to deal with it at all. So there's a difference. In one scenario, you're getting the help and the support you need to eventually get to a place where you can deal with this issue. So I think we encourage you to get the help that you need. Whether it's faith-based help, if it's a regular therapist or psychotherapist, whoever you can work with, or in some cases, I think, friends and family can help, but sometimes it's beyond their capacity. And to be quite frank, friends and family sometimes can make things worse.
I was gonna say that too. Sometimes, it might help, but it might fuel a lot of because at the end of the day, when they're not the most objective, they're gonna have your back realistically. I mean, if you're lucky enough to have a very objective friend who to tell you like it is, great. Most of the time though, with family dynamics, it makes things a little more, it makes the waters a little more murky.
Yes.
But yeah, it becomes a little more challenging. So just be mindful of, your support system and what works best for you. And you might not know what that is until you explore it. Maybe therapy isn't for you, maybe, counseling to some other degree is, maybe faith-based help is more appropriate for you. It's personal approach to you, right? But we just recommend that you do something if you're having a struggle, you're having a time to struggle. While we're your lawyers, we're not qualified as therapists, so we're not able to deal with those issues. We can assist in guiding some resources for you, but ultimately it just might be something you want to explore from the onset.
Yeah. And if you feel you don't need that and you're strong enough and your only hold up is the fact that you might reconcile and you don't want to have to do all of this to then undo it, all we can say is you don't have much of a choice, because if they do take this to a court, they will, or even an arbitrator, they would most likely be successful, because we have that's just the way our system is designed. And I think it is something
Don't
interesting.
ignore things.
People usually say, but wouldn't the judge care that she did this to our family? And yeah, so they don't.
They don't.
They
So
don't.
we have a no fault jurisdiction. The reason why you're where you are is not going to limit rights and entitlements.
Yes.
Of course, like if there's, special circumstances around parenting, that might be a special provisions that need to be,
And if we're dealing with family violence in that sense,
absolutely.
yes.
But definitely don't ignore court materials and the other partner, because I've also, been on the receiving, well, of course, on the receiving end of getting orders without the other party because of their complete lack of cooperation, thinking that it wouldn't go that far. And they end up with a very, very unfair orders because they're not participating in the process. And of course, the other side is going to be successful and, well, hopefully successful on most of their issues because there's a complete lack of response or participation from the other side. So you want to be careful not to just completely dismiss something and be uncooperative, because also there are some cost consequences to that as well.
True. All right, I think we've said enough. Just take from this that we hear you. We know that separations are not easy. The other side may be giving you signs they want to reconcile. You may want it for your family. We hear you. But sometimes you just need to double down, deal with the issues, and let the future unfold as it will. Okay. And that's it for today's episode.
Bye for
Until next
now.
time. Bye.